the tricuspid? Next.
The chordae tendineae.
The heartstrings that attach the valve to the, what's next?
Papillary muscle.
Papillary muscles. So the papillary muscles are in the atria. No, the papillary, no. Yeah, the papillary muscles are in the ventricles, and the heartstrings are coming up and attaching to that tricuspid valve that's between the atria and the ventricles. Okay?
The myocardial folds of the atrium are the pectinate muscles, and the myocardial folds of the ventricle are trabeculae carneae.
So here's the ventricle, right? There's trabecula carneae. It's not as big, but if you... We know this is the atria because it's above that, right? So that's the atria, and we've just cut through the atria. So these folds are going to be pectinate. Pectinate in the atria, trabecula carneae in the ventricles. The papillary muscles are folds, projections of muscle in the ventricles. So if you find the chordae tendineae, which is easy, the papillary muscle is here, and the valve is here. Okay? And the blood clot's there. Go ahead.
Locate the pulmonary semilunar valve.
Which we did before. We cut through the pulmonary trunk. And so this is the pulmonary semilunar. Okay?
The opening of the inferior vena cava and the opening of the coronary sinus.
Coronary sinus is that thing that I screwed up the first time, so let's not screw it up twice. That's the anterior. It's going to dump into the right atria. This heart may not be that good for it. Where did I find it? Coronary sinus. It's going to go right into the right atria. It's not a beautiful one, but you can look at this one there and realize, okay. Again, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, those would all have been branches out here that we don't see. Keep that in mind. So the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus all dump into the right atria.
Place the probe into the aorta and gently push the probe until it reaches the apex.
So what's my aorta? Big ass. Push it until it gets all the way down to the apex? Gladly. Sometimes it's just good to put your finger in there first. So smooth and cool on a hot summer day. You know what, if you look into the aorta, you see that flap? Do you see it? There on the wall of the aorta? What do you think that flap is? The aortic semilunar, yeah, it's a valve. Good. Okay, so I'm going to shove my probe through that valve and go all the way down to the apex. And it says something about don't cut through the pulmonary trunk again. Dumb shit, right?
Yeah, carefully cut through the aorta without cutting the pulmonary trunk.
And go all the way down to the apex, right?
Yep.
Get kind of slippery with this blood. So, you know, is it the end of the world if you cut that frickin' sucker that's sticking in my way? Nah. Try not to, though. Okay. Need a guide. All right, cutting through that myocardium. Wow. Guess what's thicker, the right or the left side?
The left side.
That's what I'm cutting through now. If I needed big scissors before, I really need them now. Because the left wall is much thicker. Makes sense when you think about the volume of blood that has to be pumped to the whole frickin' body out of that side, how far it has to go. 125 millimeters of mercury pressure. So can you appreciate, just look at the septum and look at the ventricular walls of the right versus the left. I mean, that's, shut the front door. That's a huge difference, right? Okay. Read on, fearless leader.
Note the thickness of the myocardium. Within the left side of the heart, locate the mitral valve.
Okay, where would we look for the mitral valve?
Is that bicuspid?
It's the bicuspid valve
Between ventricle and
between the atria and the ventricles. So this upper chamber is the atria. This lower chamber is the ventricle. So between the two is the bicuspid. Okay.
chordae tendineae.
Chordae tendineae, heartstrings, which go from the valve to the
Papillary muscle.
papillary muscle. Papillary muscle, which is a projection into the ventricle lumen, from which you find the chordae tendineae attached to the mitral or bicuspid valve. Okay, next.
Pectinate muscles.
Where do you look for the pectinate muscles? Which chamber?
In the atria.
Atria. So here's atria, here's pectinate. Here's ventricle, here's trabecula carne. Okay.
Oh, and aortic semilunar valve.
Where would you look for the aortic semilunar? In the aorta that we just cut through. So here's, and we saw it when I showed it around this way. Here's one of them. There she is, right here. Aortic semilunar. So when the heart relaxes and blood wants to go back into the left ventricle, it catches it like a parachute, and it won't let it into that left ventricle. Okay.
In the flaps of the aortic valve, locate the openings of the right and left coronary arteries.
See this little hole here? It's right in the, so when we say at the mouth of the semilunar, look for the semilunar and look for those little holes. And there's one, and there's one, representing the right and the left coronary arteries.
Note the thickness of the interventricular septum.
This is the right side, and this is the left side, and that's the septum, and that's the interventricular sulcus. Okay.
Locate the depression in the interventricular septum.
When we do fetal circulation, and I hope you guys work on this before I see you again, it's not as obvious, but there it is. It's not as obvious in the sheep's heart, but one of the differences, although there are many, between the fetus and us walking around is that we breathe and the fetus doesn't. The fetus breathes by the mother's blood supply. So does blood need to go to the lungs? The lungs aren't working yet. So normally we would have blood leaving the right ventricle to get to the lungs, right? So once blood is in the left ventricle, it has to get out. And in the infant, there is blood in the left ventricle, but it just doesn't have to go to the lungs. Very little goes to the lungs. If you were designing you would say, okay, there's got to be a way for me to get the blood either out of the ventricle once it's in there, or maybe I prevent it from getting into the ventricle in the first place. In the fetal heart, there's an opening between the right atria and the left atria. As an adult, and after you are born, that hole closes with scar tissue. That's the depression they're asking you to look for, because when blood enters into the right side of the heart in the fetus, it enters in through the right atrium, through the superior and inferior vena cava, and because of where this fossa is in the atrial wall, It diverts the blood from the right side to the left side without getting into the ventricle. Some does get into the ventricle, but if I were to shoot you with a hose, you'd get the brunt of it, but there might be some on the table. So it's kind of that, it's the angle that it goes into the heart that it actually goes through the other side. And then from the left atria, it goes to the left ventricle and then is pumped to the rest of the body, which the baby needs. So, or the fetus needs. So if this fossa doesn't close fully, you've got an issue. And that's oftentimes when they say, my baby was born with a hole in its heart. Well, unless somebody poked a hole in it, it had a hole, and that's normal, but maybe it didn't close. So that's the depression. So in the adult heart, you won't see a hole, but you could feel a depression. And in our models, I don't know if you can open that heart up and see if it is in the, sometimes it's marked in there. It is on the bigger ones. There's actually a circle there that has a number on it, but you'll get to that. Okay, so that's the fossa ovalis.
Locate the openings for the pulmonary veins.
He ain't gonna find it on this guy, but where would the 4 pulmonary veins go to?
To the heart.
Yeah, but what part of the heart?
Oh, the right. No. The left atrium.
The left atrium. So if you find the left atrium, you can look for them. They've been cut to shreds, so you're not going to find them on this guy, but that's where you would find them, if you could. That's where they used to could, before they all got cut off. Okay? And that's it. So it's kind of fun to get a real heart, because when you start looking at those, you're going to be like, ooh, that doesn't even look right. It doesn't look right because it's been pickled. This is a pig's heart. Right? I did get a pig, didn't I? Looking for a pig. Pork! Looking for a pig my whole life. Pig hearts are bigger than sheep's hearts, because pigs are bigger than sheep. I mean, you could find a small sheep and a huge pig, and you would say, yeah. Or you could find a huge sheep and a small pig, and it would be inversely related. But hogs they can be hundreds of pounds, you know, so it's not just a little pig you went to market. It's like big-ass pig. So you're going to have a relative size heart to the size of that animal. That's why the pig's hearts are a little bit bigger, and sometimes the vessels are easier to find than on the sheep's. So I'm not mad at pork. I like pork, but I ain't eating this tonight. You know, I'm not hungry. So if I were you guys, I mean, if you can afford the $3 for yourself, I'd just go ahead and buy yourself a couple, and then you can play. There could be a dissection on the exam, like that overhead that I showed, where it cuts off through the ventricles on either side, and then you can actually see the ventricular wall thickness. You can see the left versus the right side. You can see sometimes the valves, depending on what kind of a transverse section you made. So sometimes it's just fun to do something different, to see things differently, because I could do that on this heart, and you'd have to identify all of those structures for me. This is a better coronary sinus on this guy. And this guy actually has a right auricle and a left auricle. And this guy has a good pulmonary trunk, and there is a connection between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Superior vena cava, that's the best I've seen in a while, because it's usually cut off from there. There's where the coronary sinus dumps in. If this were higher, you could see the inferior, but oh well. So this is actually a good heart, even though it's got a cut up its side, to show all those external things. So these two you're going to see on the exam, on the practical. So these aren't strikingly different than what you can get at the store and study from. Do that over break on a slow day.